Hey, what's going on, guys? Welcome back to another video going over how damage works in Warframe. Today's video is going to be going over the 4 primary elemental types of damage in Warframe. These consist of cold, electricity, heat, and toxin. Now before we even start, I do want to go over the difference between primary elements and combined elements. Primary elements are just like primary colors. You can either have the basic element, or you could also combine one primary element with another primary element to then create a combined element. The combined elements will have a different status effect than the normal element, and they'll also have different weaknesses and resistances to different enemy types. But I'm going to be going over the combined elements in my next video. This video will just focus on the primary elements. For each of these elements, I'm going to be going over how their status effect works, give a grade of fair, okay, and good against each of the enemy types, and then finally at the end of the video, I'll go over how modding for elemental damage is calculated. But let's start out by looking at cold damage. Cold status effect is a freeze that causes enemies' attack, movement speed, and fire rate to be reduced by 50% while they're affected. The base duration for this status proc is 6 seconds, and while it can't be stacked multiple times to increase the effect, it can be refreshed on a target once applied. So if you proc a cold status on a target, and then proc another cold status, it'll refresh the duration on the target but not extend it. And if you're able to kill an enemy with a cold proc, it'll leave a frozen corpse behind. But in order for this to happen, the damage instance that causes the proc needs to be the last thing to kill them. So something like Frost's second ability that has a guaranteed cold proc will always cause enemies' bodies to freeze after death. But a simple cold weapon like the Glaxon won't do it unless the status proc hits last. As for cold's damage effectiveness, I would say that it's okay against Grineer, simply because most Grineer targets don't have alloy armor, and it's only a moderate 25% bonus. Cold's going to be better against Corpus, but still only okay, because it's good against Corpus units that have basic shields. And Cold is bad against Infested. It's negative against Infested Flesh, negative against Fossilized, and only provides a moderate 25% bonus against Sinew, which only 2 infested enemies have, making it only fair against them, and I would say borderline bad. If you're going to end up modding for Cold, which I wouldn't necessarily recommend, you only need to proc the Cold status once every 6 seconds. This means on an automatic weapon, you only need moderate cold damage and moderate status chance to keep enemies permanently cold procced. And personally, I'd only ever really use cold on an automatic weapon. Trying to use a slow fire weapon to proc cold is going to be much less effective. One real advantage to cold procking an enemy is that status effects are going to last longer. So you can see here that I shoot the enemy with the slash weapon, and the cold proc increases the slash duration by 50%. And just like with physical damage, the more of the cold element you have on a weapon, the easier it is to proc. So if you're trying to proc cold more often on a weapon, all you need to do is mod for more cold damage on that weapon. And I'll go into how elemental status works more at the end of the video. But let's move on to electricity damage. Electricity damage's status effect is a little more complicated. The way that it works is that when you proc it, it's going to stun the initial target for 3 seconds, and it will also chain electricity damage to all targets within 3 meters of that initial target. Electricity is a very good proc because it allows you to stun targets as well as chain more damage to targets around them. And the way that damage works is that it takes your base damage, any basic damage mod you have equipped, as well as any specific electricity mod you have equipped, and then divides that number by 2. So this means to increase your electricity proc damage, you want to be modding for basic damage and electricity damage. Other elemental damage mods, as well as other physical damage mods, won't affect your electricity proc damage. However, similarly to Slash, things like crit damage, headshot damage, and other forms of increasing your damage like Rhino's Roar will also increase your electricity proc damage. And the wiki also has an example formula here, just in case you need something to refer to later on. As far as what electricity damage is effective against, I would say that electricity damage is only fair against Grineer, especially because most Grineer units don't have machinery. It's good against Corpus because a lot of them have robotic health, and it's okay against Infested because they don't have any weaknesses or resistances to electricity damage. But that does it for electricity. Now let's look at heat. Heat status proc initially acts like a stun, where it causes enemies to flail around for a couple seconds, and the duration of this stun is going to depend on what kind of enemy you're proccing. The status effect will also deal damage over time, and this works just like electricity, so you're taking your base damage plus basic damage mods plus heat mods and then dividing by 2. This basically just means you're going to be dealing half your modded heat damage to enemies over time. The wiki also claims that weapons with innate heat damage don't apply to the damage over time ticks, but I'm not entirely sure how this works, and I wasn't able to figure out for this video. If anybody does know how the math works with the innate heat damage, please let me know in the comments below. But overall, I'd say knowing how to min-max your heat status procs isn't that important, mostly because the heat status procs aren't very good in themselves. And that's because heat status procs can't stack multiple times, meaning that every time you apply a new heat stack, it's going to refresh the duration of an old heat stack. This is bad for damage in 2 ways. The first is that you can't stack multiple damage over time ticks at the same time, meaning that your DPS with heat procs is severely limited, unlike something like Slash, where you can have as many as your duration allows. Now, the other part of this is that new status procs are going to refresh the old status proc. So if you're only dealing like 5 damage with your previous status proc, your new ones are just going to refresh that 5 damage tick. Even if you were to say get a 100 damage tick later on, it would still only be giving you 5 damage a tick, which is really not good for your overall damage. In terms of what heat damage is effective against, it's okay against Grineer, fair against Corpus, and good against infested enemies. And while the status proc is pretty good crowd control, the heat status really doesn't have the damage you're going to want out of a status effect. Now, Toxin damage, on the other hand, is an amazing status effect for dealing damage. Toxin damage is kind of like slash damage for the primary elements. And while its status effect doesn't bypass armor, it does bypass all shields, which means that enemies affected by Toxin procs will take damage directly to their health, even if they have full shields. The way the damage is calculated for this should sound very familiar at this point. You simply take the base damage of the weapon, multiply that by whatever plus damage mods you have, and then multiply by your equipped Toxin mods and divide by 2. Again, this means that other elemental damage types you've modded for won't apply to your Toxin procs damage, and the same applies for modded physical damage. But other multipliers like crit damage, headshot damage, and Warframe abilities will apply. And the Toxin status proc can be applied multiple times to the same target within the same duration. It's this stacking damage that allows Toxin to do so much damage to enemies, and is particularly effective against Corpus since it bypasses their shields entirely. Which brings me to what Toxin is effective against. It's okay against Grineer, especially because most Grineer enemies again are not going to have machinery. It's good against Corpus, even though it has negative robotic damage, and again this is mostly because it's going to bypass their shields entirely, which cuts out a huge amount of effective health. And as for infested enemies, I would say it's only fair, especially because Toxic Ancients are going to nullify your Toxin procs, making it a far less useful element to run against infested. It's not terrible, but you might want to bring another weapon to take care of the Toxic Ancients without Toxin damage. But that covers it for the basics of the 4 primary elemental damage types. Now let's talk about how modding for elemental damage works. To understand this, let's talk about the difference between plus damage mods and elemental mods. The wiki refers to plus damage mods as plus base damage. And that's simply because plus damage mods increase your weapon's innate damage types. This is what's referred to as base damage. The reason it's called base damage is that the bonus that elemental mods provide is based on this number. So if you have a weapon with 100 base damage and you equip a 90% elemental mod, that elemental mod is going to give you 90 elemental damage. That's a pretty clean example, but let's take a look at the Soma Prime to see how this works in action. So the Soma Prime's base damage is a combination of its impact, slash, and puncture all combined. For this weapon, it gives us 12 base damage. If we were to then add Serration to this, Serration is going to give us a 2.65 times damage multiplier, which puts us at 31.8 total damage. Now, the interesting thing about plus damage mods is that they round down to the nearest whole number, meaning that instead of actually getting 31.8, we're only going to be getting 31 damage here. So if we're to add our IPS values up here after we add Serration, we're going to get 31 total damage. Now, if we were to add Stormbringer on top of this, which gives us 90% electricity damage, we're going to be getting 27.9 damage, which is 90% of the 31 damage. So I hope that makes sense. Serration as a plus damage mod increases the innate damage of the weapon, and then Stormbringer as an elemental mod will then give you the listed percent of your base damage as the electricity damage type. So here we get 27.9 electricity damage, which is 90% of our 31 base damage. The same concept will apply if you add other damage types as well, but I'll be covering that more in my next video. Here, let's just focus on single damage types. So if you're looking to mod for a specific damage type, you want to be running as many plus damage mods as you can get, in addition to elemental mods of that damage type. So here, for electricity damage, we're running Stormbringer as well as High Voltage. And I've also added Heavy Caliber to increase our base damage. With all these mods together, we get a total of 76 electricity damage. Now, having higher electricity damage here does 2 things. The first is that it'll increase the amount of damage we get with our electricity procs, and the second thing is that it's going to increase the frequency at which we proc electricity versus impact, slash, or puncture. Because the more of a damage type you have on a weapon, the better the chance is that you proc that damage type as a status. And there's a difference between elemental damage and physical damage when you're trying to figure out the frequency at which you're proccing statuses. I say frequency here and not chance, just to differentiate the effect that increasing damage on a weapon has. So with these specific damage values, we're only going to get a 27.27% chance to proc an electricity status. The next damage type, on the other hand, slash, is going to have a 36.36% chance to proc. And that's simply because physical damage types are weighted 4 times that of elemental damage types. So in order for electricity and slash to have the same chance to proc here, you would need to have 102 electricity damage to match Slash's 25.5 slash damage. And again, this is because physical statuses are weighted 4 times the amount of elemental statuses. Now, if we were to remove Stormbringer from this build and take our electricity damage down to 30.6, the chance of us proccing an electricity status with one of our Soma pellets goes down to 13.04. I'm going to be making a longer, more detailed video about how status chance works, but I'm hoping for this video you at least take away that having more of an element on a weapon is better for proccing that status, and that weapons with physical damage types are going to dilute the amount of elemental procs you get. But that's going to do it for this video covering the 4 primary elemental damage types. If you guys have any questions or suggestions about something I covered here, please leave them in the comments below. And if you found the video helpful, I'd appreciate it if you leave a like. And make sure you hit that subscribe button for future content. That's going to do it for me. Hope you're all having a good one, and I'll see you later.